This video is made possible by Nebula. Go to nebula.tv/ThomasFlight to sign up and support my channel today. When we talk about the meaning of a film or the story it tells, we often focus on what we're seeing or what is happening on screen. But how a movie is made or how a story is shown can often communicate just as much as what is shown. And in some movies, the how is where the entire thematic content of the film lies. I'm going to show you a scene of some basic domestic activity, and I want you to pay attention not to what is happening, but how the scene is being filmed. What details do you notice about the filmmaking approach itself? First, we might notice that the camera is stationary. It uses wide neutral angles that don't emphasize anything in particular. Second, we might see that the scene is lit with natural light. There's no soft cinematic shadows, the room is fairly dark, and the windows are blown out. It's not unlike what you might see if you set up a camera in your own house and film it without any special lighting. Third, if we pay attention with our ears, we might notice that this scene doesn't sound like most movies.
Sophie?
Most movies sound nothing like reality. There's a crisp warmth and clarity to the dialogue.
Where should I put this?
In the kitchen.
We only hear sound effects that are visible on screen and important. An ambient background sound is smooth and undistracting.
Often a film will have nice, glossy, big sound, footsteps crunch and clump, and things have a zing to them, and this film definitely had the opposite of that.
I spoke with sound designer Johnnie Burn about the approach to designing the sound of this film.
John and I really spent months carefully attenuating, where would we hear the clock ticking and what would the level of the chiming be. If that person's left the room, we should still hear their feet when they're on the floor above, and if the boy's banging the drum, he wouldn't stop just so the camera's not on it. All those things.
The sounds of the surrounding environment are much louder relative to the dialogue than we expect from a feature film. All these stylistic choices avoid the dramatic conventions of filmmaking, the way filmmakers style images, sound, performances, and editing in order to make things more tense, dark, dramatic, or whatever best fits the purposes of the story. But what we have here is something that feels more like a raw documentary image than a piece of polished dramatic cinema. But what does all this matter? Well, what this scene means, the story it tells us, is only possible because of the way it was created. I'll come back to how the visuals affect the meaning later, but for now let's focus on the sound. Why does this unique approach to sound affect not just the way the scene feels, but what it means? Well, it's because the most important part of this scene is not what's happening in the house, but actually what's happening outside near the house. The significance of this becomes obvious later in this scene when this woman is trying on a coat. As she does, we begin to notice sounds from outside the house. And there's nothing unusual about this yet besides the fact that these are the kinds of sounds that most movies would filter out. But then we hear this. What sounds like gunshots. And yet this woman does not react to them at all. And we're left asking, why wasn't she bothered by them? Does she know it was something else? Are gunshots just a normal part of this woman's life? And it's right there, in the interaction between the sound we hear outside and the woman's lack of reaction, that we find the meaning the scene is trying to convey. And this story in this scene is a microcosm of the story the entire film is telling.
Aber das Leben, das wir führen, ist dieses Opfer auf jeden Fall wert.
The zone of interest is about a horrifying disconnect. It's about a real couple, the commandant of Auschwitz, Rudolf Haas, and his wife, who lived with their family next to the concentration camp, separated by only a wall, while daily mass murder and inconceivable levels of suffering were taking place right next door. How can any human perpetrate such unimaginable horror? And how can they choose to live alongside it?
Bist du aber wirklich auf den Füßen gelandet, mein Kind?
This is the question that the zone of interest asks, not just in what it shows us, but in how it shows us that story. In order to examine this question, the film subjects us to a simulation of their lives. Instead of providing us with an answer, it simply shows us what their lives might have actually looked like and sounded like, and then invites us to contemplate the question of how they could live like this for ourselves. To create this simulation, years of research were conducted. A few scenes were shot in the original Haas family home, but most of it was shot in a meticulously reconstructed version of the house on location in Poland. The garden was recreated by the production team, and witness testimony was scoured for any mention of what their life would have been like, bits of dialogue, and details of the sights and sounds of the environment they lived in. Then, once this filmmaking location was set up as accurately as possible, a series of observational scenes that depict the family's day-to-day life were captured. The style of filmmaking we identified earlier, with its static cameras and natural lighting, is applied to the entire film. This documentarian approach even affects the editing. Scenes play out in real time, as one continuous take stitched together from multiple cameras that were set up all over the house and garden. Editing is not used in this film to speed things up or make them more dramatic. It just moves our eye from camera to camera so that we can see the events taking place. In this way, much more attention is given to the continuity of scenes than is normal for a film. This extreme dedication to realism was even applied to how the sound of the footsteps were captured.
I had a brilliant team of cobblestone Foley based in Poland, and they went to the original house and recorded, all the kind of footsteps and door handles and walking down corridors and all those sounds as well that we could augment the production sound with to make it all sound super credible and real and lived in, basically.
I think a lot of people might hear that and they would think, well, so what if the clock ticking is, exactly the right level? Why was that so important to the process here?
Very much, it was to avoid in any way it being a dramatization. I think authenticity is absolutely key, and the more this feels like a document, the more credible it is. And I think there was an enormous desire to avoid any form of sensationalism as well.
This is all a very specific how, but what meaning does this approach communicate within the film? Since Jonathan Glazer knew the film would focus visually on the Nazi family, he wanted to avoid the tools of filmmaking that might glamorize their life. For him, the easiest way to ensure he was doing this would be to use as naturalistic a style as possible and to ground the film in reality as much as he could. Once all these scenes of the family drama were shot, Jonathan Glazer and picture editor Paul Watts then spent a year in post carefully shaping the narrative of the day-to-day family drama we see on screen, along with the sound of everything that makes the house feel busy and lived in. This left them with a completed version of the film that the team called Film 1. Then Glazer and sound designer Johnnie Burn started over from the beginning, creating the most important part of the story. A second full layer of sound design, one that represents everything that lies over the garden wall. This side of the story, that we never see but only hear, is what the team called Film 2.
Eva, the producer on the Polish side, called me up before the shoot began a few weeks and said, "Oh my goodness, you've got your own kind of a whole film shoot of your own without cameras to go and do."
For Johnnie Burn, creating this Film 2 soundscape would require a completely unique approach to the sound design process.
There was an enormous amount of responsibility, obviously, to the witnesses and to the survivors and to the victims of Auschwitz and their families to be as documentary accurate as possible about the sounds that we were going to be using to represent what happened.
This meant ensuring that the sounds we hear are true to events that would have actually happened.
Reading witness testimony, reading the testimonies from the Nuremberg trials, and via Jonathan himself, a lot of insight from the Auschwitz Memorial Museum archive. Really reading reams and reams of documents and noting every time that it said anything that specifically related to sound, like it might say what the electric fence sounded like, for example, reading about events that happened of torture and brutality and working out, what that might have sounded like.
And that those sounds actually sound believable as those things.
We did try actors, and the minute anything was remotely not real, it would like have a big red arrow pointing at it. It became so obviously wrong.
They had to collect actual sounds of shouting and screaming from the real world.
What we found that was most viable was to attempt to be out in the real world and capture sounds that sounded credible, people in pain or or shouts in different languages and different nationalities, and to repurpose them and to allow the context of the film to be the strongest driver of their meaning. During the time period in which the film is set, a lot of the prisoners on the arrivals at that point were from France. And there was a riot in Paris, and one of my team went over to go and sort of wander around that with some kind of microphones hidden on their lapels of their jacket, but basically out in a public space. And, you know, and there was a lot of kind of French painful screaming going on, for example. We did an awful lot of things like that, and a little bit of specific things with actors that we needed. And then we would develop them into sort of scenarios, a shout here and a bit there, in order to create something that related directly to a narrative that we would have read, or an event that we would have read about. And then we spent about another 3 or 4 months editing that film 2 onto film 1.
The result of all of this are some of the most haunting and disturbing sounds I've ever heard anywhere, much less in a film. Sounds that to me would feel inappropriate to play for you here, just as an example, outside of their intended context within the film. But why did they finish film 1 completely before starting film 2? To understand this, we'll have to dig a little deeper into why the film is structured the way it is and the thematic purpose that that structure serves. The zone of interest opens with a haunting 3 minutes of darkness. This opening engages 2 things you will need to fully understand the film: your imagination and your ears. The horrifying score, instead of accompanying and reinforcing images we're seeing on screen, suggests images of its own that only exist in your mind. These opening moments act as a kind of guide, teaching you how you'll need to watch the film. To understand cinematic space, it may prove useful to consider it as, in fact, consisting of 2 kinds of space, that included within the frame and that outside the frame. That's Noël Burch in his book Theory of Film Practice, describing the significance of off-screen space in movies. Here's film educator Sharon McDonagh expounding on this idea. Burch invites us to think of the film not as a boundary, but as a window to a larger world. The space beyond the frame isn't empty. It's filled with potential narratives, emotions, and meanings, waiting to be activated by the viewer's imagination. Every film contains space we never see, space that lies outside the frame. If a character looks off screen, we often understand intuitively what they're looking at. Our imagination automatically fills in the space. Composition, performance, set design, and sound can all be used to suggest things that only exist in the off-screen space of a film. Occasionally in movies, important elements of the plot or story happen in this off-screen space. Or a director might choose to momentarily keep something the characters on screen are reacting to in off-screen space in order to create a sense of suspense. In horror films, the monster might be kept off-screen for most of the film in order to engage our imagination and create terror. But rarely is the off-screen space an essential element throughout the entire film, and even less frequently is the most important aspect of the film there the entire time. This is the cinematic device the entirety of the zone of interest is built around. Film 1, the one we watch, shows us the banal domestic life of the Haas family. We are never allowed to see over the wall. But while we never see the camp itself or the suffering happening there, that's not to say it's absent from the story. Its presence is constantly invoked. Provoked by what we hear in film 2, it remains horrifyingly ever present in our imagination. The decision for the film not to look traps us, the viewer, inside the compartmentalization and disconnect that the Haas family lived within. This is a movie that works on some level by offending our sensibilities. Watching it, I have this gnawing feeling that the film's attention is directed at the wrong thing. Why are we here looking at these horrible people relaxing in their garden? Aren't the victims of their evil so much more worthy of our remembrance and attention? And it's this feeling that the film's attention should be elsewhere but isn't that brings into focus what the film wants us to think about. Where in our lives are we like the Haas family, ignoring the things that we should be paying attention to? Creating the film in two separate parts like this, film 1 and film 2, baked this disconnect into the structure of the film itself. It was impossible for the actors performing or the cinematography or editing to react to film 2 because it didn't exist when film 1 was being made. And the use of sound instead of images to reflect the camp isn't just a reflection of the compartmentalization. I think one of the significant effects of this decision is that instead of confronting you with images that you on some level know are fictional recreations made by actors, you're forced to fill in those gaps yourself. For me, those gaps throughout the running time of the film were filled largely with thoughts about the actual historical events and the real people who experienced them. I think in a way this is why, despite not showing anything, the zone of interest felt more intense to me than some Holocaust films that actually show depictions of the horror. One of the most haunting elements of the film 2 sound for me is not a specific individual sound we hear, like the gunshots or screams. It's the unending ambient rumble of the camp that persists through almost every moment in the film.
Ist schön, nicht?
As with every other aspect of the movie, a lot of thought went into what this sound should represent.
It's everything. It's footsteps and it's the rumblings of trains. It was just a sound that we felt represented the scale of what was happening. When we first saw the film through with that on, it was remarkable, and quite profound, the effect that constant juxtaposition created, and it does hold you like a vice, doesn't it? There's no escape.
But while working on the sound mix, the team made a somewhat haunting discovery about this sound.
The most significant oddity that I'd never encountered before was you would become immune to it the more you hear it. On the mixing stage, if we started playing the film like an hour in, like you might do when you're halfway through a week and you're working through a film, the first time I did that, we were all like, shit, that's all too loud. Like, what the hell, Johnny, has the cleaner pushed the buttons overnight, or what's happened? And I was like, yeah, sorry, obviously there's a mistake. But it was only we found that we had to play the film all the way through from the beginning to become immune to it, to understand how to attenuate it.
Even within the span of a single feature film, it's possible for the viewer's ears to begin tuning out these sounds. And to me, this represents the crux of the movie. Here is a family for whom the sound of human suffering has become mere background noise. And I'm left wondering, to what extent has the suffering around me become background noise in my own life? Is it possible for a film like this to shatter our own sense of complacency by forcing us to take a literal, long, hard look at one of the most obscene cases of complacency in history? I'm not sure, but I certainly value art that tries. I've been talking about the effect and meaning of the stylistic approach to this film, but for director Jonathan Glazer, his choice to make it this way was for him partly an ethical one. How we depict and consume images of suffering is something I'm left thinking about here because of the way the zone of interest presents the idea that it's possible to become numb to the suffering that surrounds us. This discussion is super relevant to a lot of movies that have come out recently, like Oppenheimer, Civil War, and Killers of the Flower Moon. I wanted to explore this whole discussion more thoroughly, but to really talk about this in detail on YouTube would almost certainly result in a video that would be both demonetized and age restricted. So for that reason, I've created an entire second video that explores how we think about depicting and consuming images of suffering. Susan Sontag, in her book Regarding the Pain of Others, opens chapter 2 by saying, "Being a spectator of calamities taking place in another country is a quintessentially modern experience." So this video is over 30 minutes of a deep dive into a lot of the nuance of this issue, taking a look at what critics like Susan Sontag and John Berger have to say about the issue. And you can watch this video on Nebula by clicking the link in the description below. Nebula is an independent streaming service that myself and a bunch of other creators made so that we would have the freedom to create content that wouldn't be viable on YouTube, either because it'd be demonetized or because it requires more money, effort, and production value. You can watch all our regular videos there early and without any sponsors or ads, but the real selling point of Nebula is the quickly growing library of exclusive and original content that you can't find anywhere else. By signing up for Nebula using my link, you're supporting my channel and helping me create the best work I can. If you sign up using my link by going to nebula.tv/thomasflight, you'll even get 40% off the annual plan. So Nebula is only going to cost you $2.50 a month. And if you want to go all in on your support, right now we offer lifetime memberships. So for a one-time fee of $300, you can have access to Nebula for the rest of your life. No need to manage your subscription or any reoccurring charges. These lifetime memberships help us raise funds for bigger and better creator-owned Nebula originals. I want to say thank you to all those who have already used the link and signed up for Nebula for supporting my work and that of all the other great creators on Nebula. Nebula is a big part of what makes my work and these videos possible. If you want to join in and get access to all the great exclusive content on Nebula and support our work, go to nebula.tv/thomasflight or click the link on the screen to sign up using my code.